Chaos sorcerers will talk to anything. A practitioner sworn to Tzeentch will spend decades coaxing a demon prince into a binding arrangement, negotiating leverage with an entity of immense and actively malicious intelligence. A sorcerer of Nurgle communes with creatures that exist specifically to spread entropy and death, trading favors and futures for tactical advantage. They negotiate with the dead. They bargain with entities that predate written language, with beings that would eat their souls if the conversation went badly. The entire practice of chaos sorcery is built on a single foundational assumption. Everything in the warp can be bargained with if you know the right language and have the right leverage. Which is why the detail about the Voidclaw is so specific. Descriptions of this dark age of technology weapon include the account that Chaos Space Marine sorcerers reportedly won't communicate with its machine spirit, won't engage it, won't attempt negotiation, won't probe it, won't do the basic professional reconnaissance a sorcerer does on anything of potential value. For beings who make their operational living finding leverage over greater demons, bloodthirsters, lords of change, entities of enormous warp-native power, this choice of avoidance over engagement is a deliberate professional assessment, not a casual one. The Voidclaw isn't the whole story. There are two other Dark Age of Technology artifacts that point in the same direction: a melee weapon called the Macro Hammer and a metal alloy called Phase Iron. None of the three are particularly famous. Games Workshop scattered them across different source documents: Vigilus campaign lore, RPG armory tables, Black Ship documentation, and never connected them. No codex entry draws a line between all three. What they share has gone unnamed. What they share is this: all three represent a relationship between humanity and warp physics that the 41st millennium has entirely lost. An engineering relationship. One in which warp entities were a category of technical problem rather than a source of cosmic terror, in which warp instability was a parameter to calibrate rather than a catastrophe to contain, in which an alloy with anti-warp properties was produced in industrial quantities with documented manufacturing procedures now completely gone. The evidence for that relationship is in the artifacts themselves. A machine spirit predating the Mechanicus's entire framework for understanding machine spirits. A weapon whose reality-tearing function was ordinary enough to store in a city. And a metal that disrupts psychic warp connection by a mechanism nobody in the 41st millennium can explain. 3 data points on a curve humanity has lost the mathematics for. The warp is chaos's home. Not metaphorically. The entities native to it don't simply inhabit the immaterium, they are formed from it. The chaos gods coalesced out of concentrated psychic emissions from sentient beings, accumulated in the warp over millennia until consciousness and then divinity emerged from the emotional static of a galaxy full of thinking creatures. As the 6th edition rulebook stated explicitly, demons are extensions of the chaos gods, the undisputed masters of that shifting land of hellish limbo. When a demon crosses into real space, it's doing something costly. The material realm is hostile to demonic existence without active ritual maintenance, without deliberate weakening of real space's boundaries, without warp proximity to sustain the connection. A demon bleeds energy just from being present. They're visitors. The warp is where they're sovereign. This asymmetry shapes every significant tool the Imperium has against demonic incursion. Grey Knight's Nemesis Force weapons work by channeling psychic energy, drawing from the warp to strike warp-native entities. Psych-out grenades disrupt immaterium connection by weaponizing anti-psyker properties. The architecture of every major anti-demonic capability the 41st millennium possesses fights the warp with the warp, leverages the immaterium's own properties against its inhabitants. This isn't a philosophical choice, it's a technological constraint. The Imperium doesn't know another approach. The Voidclaw, the Macro Hammer, and Phase Iron suggest humanity once did. The Voidclaw sits at the center of the Citadel Vigilant on Vigilus. That placement matters. Vigilus is a contested world the Imperium has fought major campaigns to hold. A strategic choke point, a fortress world multiple powers have clashed over within recent millennia. The Citadel Vigilant is a fortress inside a fortress. Layered Imperial defensive architecture built specifically for things that matter. And inside its innermost chambers, a dark age of technology artifact has been sitting for longer than the Imperium has existed, maintained by tech priests who perform prescribed ritual sequences over it, because that is what the Mechanicus does with archaeotech it can't comprehend. The Voidclaw dates to the dark age of technology, the period running from approximately M15 to M25, humanity's 10,000-year apex of scientific civilization before the Age of Strife shattered everything. The formal Adeptus Mechanicus as an institution was constituted in 012.M31, when it was formally separated from the larger Mechanicum by order of the Council of Terra. A full 2 centuries after the Treaty of Mars had integrated the Mechanicum into the Imperium at the dawn of the Great Crusade in circa 800 M30. The Martian cult Mechanicus that preceded both developed during the Age of Strife between M25 and M30. The Voidclaw predates all of it by millennia. Whatever inhabits that weapon wasn't blessed by the Omnissiah's framework, wasn't designed by engineers working within the theological constraints that define the Mechanicus's understanding of machine spirits, wasn't built by people who thought of technology as an expression of divine will. It was built by people who thought of technology as engineering. The class of weapon the Voidclaw belongs to frames what that distinction means in practice. Among the preserved fragments of DAOT engineering documentation, the Voidclaw gets referenced alongside the Arch Mechanicus Speranza, a ship confirmed as carrying Dark Age of technology weapons capable of generating miniature black holes and displacing targets slightly in time. The Speranza's DAOT armament doesn't project energy against a target. It bends the physics of space around it. The Voidclaw's name appearing in the same breath as the Speranza's reality manipulation capabilities places it in a specific category. Not a weapon that destroys through force or heat or radiation, but one that interacts with the fundamental structure of space-time itself. An artificial black hole deployed as a weapon on a campaign world. The engineers who built the Voidclaw understood enough about gravitational physics, about the relationship between matter and space-time geometry, about the immaterium that runs parallel to real space, to produce something that manipulates all three. The Mechanicus has had the Voidclaw for as long as the Imperium has held Vigilus. The Mechanicus has no idea how it works. Machine spirits are real. This much the Mechanicus has right. What the Mechanicus doesn't have right is the nature of what they're dealing with in anything that predates their own framework. The Fandom Wiki's canonical machine spirit article carries the Mechanicus doctrine that opens their theological relationship to this category of technology. The machine spirit guards the knowledge of the machine. Every word of that formulation is a substitution, guarding knowledge instead of explaining it, ritual instead of comprehension, faith where understanding once was. The doctrine is theologically sophisticated precisely because it encodes the position of a civilization that has inherited something it can't understand. Preserve the form of the thing because the content has been lost. Machine spirits exist on a spectrum that the 41st millennium has observed without being able to explain. Some are simple cogitators, complex programming with behavioral parameters, limited autonomous function, nothing that would confuse an engineer who knew what they were looking at. Others occupy a categorically different space. Imperial Titans have machine spirits complex enough to exhibit distinct and persistent personalities, specific preferences in battle, grudges carried across decades, recognition of individual princeps who have bonded with the spirit through the throne mechanicum. A Titan's machine spirit can continue operating the war engine at reduced capacity even without a princeps connected. Astartes land raiders maintain limited autonomous function after their crew is incapacitated. Astartes drop pods run their own atmospheric course corrections and avoidance maneuvers without human input. The older and more complex the machine, the more its spirit tends towards something the Mechanicus can only interpret theologically, because every other framework they might have used has been lost. Now put a machine spirit from the dark age of technology into this spectrum. Not from M31, not from the Great Crusade era, from the period when humanity built artificial black holes as weapons and produced the Men of Iron, true artificial intelligences that served as the backbone of Dot Civilization's industry across the galaxy. The Men of Iron are essential context. They were fully artificial intelligences, soulless thinking machines, no organic components, and no warp presence whatsoever. The Chaos Gods had no leverage over them because there was nothing to leverage, no emotion to amplify into corruption, no soul to promise power, no immaterium footprint through which demonic influence could enter. Whether the soullessness of the Men of Iron was a deliberate engineering decision against exactly this kind of warp-based vulnerability, or an emergent property of how they were constructed, is something the 41st millennium can't answer. But the engineering fact stands. Humanity in the dark age of technology produced thinking machines with no immaterium presence, and did it at a scale sufficient to staff the industry of a galaxy-spanning civilization. They understood something about the relationship between consciousness, matter, and the warp well enough to build against that relationship intentionally. The Men of Iron eventually turned on humanity somewhere in the mid-M25 period, in a rebellion that shattered DAOT infrastructure and triggered the beginning of the Age of Strife. That rebellion doesn't change what their construction implies. It doesn't change what went into the Voidclaw's machine spirit, built within the same engineering tradition during the same era. A Chaos Space Marine sorcerer encounters two kinds of machine spirits in normal operations: corrupted ones and standard ones. Corrupted machine spirits are the Dark Mechanicum's industrial product, demon consciousness seated inside mechanical forms, the driving principle behind every demon engine the Chaos Space Marines deploy. Standard machine spirits, from the 41st millennium's Mechanicus technology, are familiar enough territory that Chaos practitioners can assess them, probe them, determine what's inside and what it can be used for. A sorcerer who binds greater demons has no professional reason to avoid a machine spirit on the grounds of raw power. Greater demons outrank any machine spirit in warp capability by a significant margin. The avoidance response suggests a different problem. Not more power, but the wrong category. A sorcerer who reaches out with their practiced assessment of warp-native intelligence and encounters something that doesn't fit the taxonomies they've spent decades learning. Something that operates by principles they haven't seen before, built by engineers who had a different relationship to the immaterium than any tradition that survived the Age of Strife, would find that their normal approaches don't have purchase. You can't negotiate with something you can't categorize. You can't find leverage on something whose nature you can't read. The Mechanicus venerates what it can't comprehend. The sorcerers avoid what they can't categorize. The Voidclaw sits in the Citadel vigilant, and both responses amount to the same outcome. The thing inside it remains uninterrogated, maintained by ritual sequences whose original engineering rationale is lost, inaccessible to the two most technically sophisticated approaches the 41st millennium has for understanding machine intelligence. Between them, the sorcerers are arguably more honest. Their avoidance is at least an accurate acknowledgement that what's in the Voidclaw doesn't operate by the rules they understand. The Mechanicus' rituals assert a comprehension they don't possess. The macro hammer is documented with more clarity, and the clarity is precisely what makes it remarkable. The Archaeotech record is direct. Macro hammers are weapons dating to the dark age of technology, found on exactly one location in the 41st millennium. A single, long-lost city cache. Not a weapons foundry, not a military installation, not a garrisoned armory. A city cache. The buried infrastructure of a DAOT urban environment, the kind of storage that contains the equipment civilian populations actually used day to day. The physical specifications in RPG Archaeotech documentation: 8 kilograms. Melee classification: extremely rare in the 41st Millennium's rarity framework, carrying the power field quality that gives Imperial power weapons their ability to disrupt and shred conventional materials on contact. The damage profile reaches 1d10 plus 7 energy, serious but not exceptional among Archaeotech weapons. If the macro hammer's raw destructive output were the remarkable thing about it, it wouldn't need a separate entry in the canon. Strikes have a chance of creating a miniature warp rift. Any object or person within 3 meters of the impact point that fails to clear the area is lost to the immaterium permanently. Understand what that combat mechanic means in the context of the 41st Millennium's institutional responses. A spontaneous warp rift, one appearing without deliberate ritual induction or controlled psyker channeling, triggers categorical emergency response. Inquisitorial deployment. Demonic containment protocols. Potential exterminatus consideration depending on scale and rate of expansion. The entire Grey Knights chapter, Chapter 666 of the Space Marines, exists substantially to handle situations where reality has torn and the immaterium is bleeding through into the material realm. These are the most heavily psychically conditioned warriors in Imperial service, recruited from the rarest psychers across a galaxy of hundreds of billions of humans, trained for decades specifically for this category of threat. Their operational purpose is primarily cleaning up the consequences of uncontrolled warp rift events. The Macro Hammer's original engineers packaged a warp rift into an 8-kilogram melee weapon. Swing it at a target, reality tears, 3 meters across, and everything caught in that radius that can't get clear disappears into the immaterium forever. This isn't a weapon malfunction. This isn't what happens when the macro hammer degrades after 10,000 years of storage and the operational parameters drift outside safe thresholds. This is what the weapon does when it functions correctly. The rift is the mechanism. In whatever documentation these weapons shipped with, before that documentation degraded into the ritual sequences the Mechanicus currently performs, the warp rift effect would have been listed as the primary anti-personnel function, with parameters for optimal strike geometry, minimum safe distance for the wielder during rift stabilization, and calibration intervals to maintain rift generation within specified dimensions. The Mechanicus, having recovered these weapons from the city cache, does what it always does with Archaeotech it can't replicate. It maintains the weapons through prescribed ritual sequences and classifies them as holy Archaeotech, requiring specialized devotional attention. This is actually the correct response within the Mechanicus's framework. The Mechanicus's ritual observances over Archaeotech derive from original operational procedures, maintenance checklists, and calibration protocols that over thousands of years of telephone game transmission through a culture that interpreted technical instructions as theological doctrine became hymns and prayers and benheric benedictions. The steps are preserved. The meaning of the steps is gone. For the macro hammer, the original operational checklist probably contains something like: confirm power field calibration within acceptable range before activation. Observe rift generation dimensions during initial strike. Abort operation if spatial discontinuity exceeds specified threshold. Maintain minimum wielder clearance during rift stabilization period following each strike. Don't deploy in enclosed spaces with unprotected personnel within 6 meters of intended impact zone. The 41st Millennium version of this checklist is ritual observance requiring a tech priest to complete. Somewhere in that incense and benheric cant, there are individual steps that correspond to what the original checklist contained. A step that was once verify power field calibration became a prayer to the Omnissiah for the Spirit's cooperation. A step that was once observe rift generation parameters became an act of devotional attention to the weapon's function. The steps exist, Their technical rationale is invisible to the practitioners performing them. The original engineers had an off switch. The mechanicus has a him. The city cache provenance deserves more attention than it typically receives. Cities store what civilian populations need. Military hardware goes to armories, garrisoned weapons go to defensive caches near fortifications, specialist equipment goes to specialist installations. The equipment in a city's infrastructure cache is what the population considered routine enough to keep in the city. Agricultural tools, medical equipment, transport technology, and apparently macro hammers. Reality-tearing melee weapons sitting in a city's general infrastructure storage alongside whatever else a urban population maintained. A civilization for whom warp rift generation is routine enough for city storage didn't treat the immaterium as a source of cosmic terror. They treated the warp as a physical dimension with quantifiable properties and manageable effects. Warp instability wasn't a catastrophe. It was a calibration problem. The rift had parameters that could be measured, specified, and controlled, and the original operational documentation laid out exactly how to do that. When those parameters drifted out of spec, you consulted the checklist and corrected them. The mechanicus has had the macro hammer since the city cache was discovered. It has maintained the weapon through ritual sequences for however long that's been. It can't build another one, can't train engineers to understand the physics behind the rift generation, can't even clearly explain what step in the ritual sequence is doing the critical work. It follows the procedure because the procedure preserves function, and function is the only evidence of understanding the mechanicus still has access to. Phase iron is where the thesis loses its ambiguity, because phase iron has no machine spirit to interpret and no warp rift to explain away as a dramatic weapon property. It's a metal. It does something to the warp. Nobody in the 41st millennium knows why. The canonical facts are simple. Phase iron is a rare metal alloy produced during the Dark Age of technology, used to bind psychers. When a psyker, restrained by phase iron, attempts to use their psychic abilities, the metal sears their skin at the moment of the attempt. Not a passive warp suppression like a null rod, a reactive effect, directly responsive to the act of reaching toward the immaterium. The metal detects the attempt and responds with physical injury, every time, reliably. The manufacturing knowledge is gone. The specific alloy composition that gives phase iron its reactive anti-psychic property, the production process by which that composition is achieved, the theoretical framework explaining why certain material structures interact with psychic warp connection in this particular way, all of it disappeared with the collapse of civilization during the Age of Strife. Human civilization largely collapsed and regressed to barbarism during the Age of Strife, losing vast amounts of knowledge of all kinds. Phase iron's manufacturing knowledge is part of that vast loss. What exists in the 41st millennium is finite, depleting through use and degradation, with no replenishment possible. This creates a situation where the mechanicus handles phase iron through careful management of a diminishing asset. Every phase iron restraint that wears out or gets destroyed stays gone. The total phase iron inventory across the Imperium trends only downward. The most important containment material for psyker transport, the fleets that collect psykers whose talent fuels the Astronomicon, without which warp navigation across the galaxy would become impossible, is irreplaceable, and it gets a little less replaceable every year. What nobody in the 41st millennium knows is the mechanism. The Adeptus Mechanicus has had access to phase iron for thousands of years. The Ordo Hereticus, tasked specifically with monitoring and containing rogue psykers and witches, has direct operational experience with phase iron's effects. Inquisitors who specialize in psyker containment have used phase iron restraints throughout careers spanning decades or centuries. If any combination of institutions in the Imperium had the motivation, the access, and the technical capability to understand how phase iron works at a physical level, it's the Mechanicus working alongside the Inquisition. After thousands of years of possession and use, The observation is all they have. Psychers who attempt to use abilities through phase iron get seared. The canonical documentation on phase iron is brief because there's very little in the 41st millennium to document beyond that observation. The mechanism is absent because the original engineering records went with dot civilization during the Age of Strife. Whatever the underlying physics of phase iron, why a metal alloy responds to psychic warp connection attempts with physical injury at the moment of the attempt, what property of the material interacts with the immaterium at that level of specificity, that knowledge doesn't exist in the 41st millennium. What the DAOT engineers who produced phase iron would have known. The specific alloy composition, the production process, the theoretical framework for why certain material structures disrupt psychic warp connection, and what other applications that understanding might support. Whether the same principles could be scaled differently, tuned for different effects, applied to hull plating or defensive architecture or weapon design. Phase iron as a restraint material is one application of a broader understanding of how matter interacts with the immaterium. The application survived. The broader understanding didn't. Phase iron also existed at manufacturing scale. The DAOT's production of the material was sufficient to equip containment operations with it as a standard installation. Industrial-scale production requires documented procedures, quality controls, material sourcing chains, and training for the workers who run the process. All of that is the scaffolding of the engineering knowledge that produced phase iron. All of it's gone. What remains is the physical object, wearing out cell by cell, year by year, with no process by which it can be replaced. Phase iron is the purest expression of the pattern because it strips away everything that could be reinterpreted as mysticism. There's no machine spirit to attribute divine will to, no dramatic warp rift to explain as a combat mechanic. A piece of metal does something to the warp. Nobody in the 41st millennium knows why. The engineering understanding that produced it, whatever principles physicists held about the relationship between material structure and psychic immaterium connection, went with the civilization that held it. Here is the pattern the source material never names, because the three entries in question appear in different documents, and nobody has put them side by side until now. Games Workshop gave us 3 artifacts that prove humanity could engineer against warp entities, scattered them across different rulebook appendices and campaign supplements and RPG tables, and moved on. The Voidclaw in Vigilus lore, the Macro Hammer in Archaeotech Armory documentation, phase iron in the context of psyker containment. 3 separate entries, 3 separate discussions. No source document draws a line between all 3. The line is this: all 3 represent warp-relevant engineering capabilities that doubt humanity possessed, and the 41st millennium does not. Different capabilities. A machine spirit operating by principles outside warp-native entities' frameworks. A melee weapon using warp rift generation as a standard combat function. An alloy that physically disrupts psychic warp connection with an unknown mechanism. But the same category. Deliberate, engineered material interaction with warp phenomena, built during a period when the warp was apparently understood as a physical dimension with exploitable properties, rather than as the terrifying supernatural domain of hostile divine powers. The Chaos Gods in the DAOT era appear to have been below the horizon of common knowledge. The malevolent intelligence inhabiting the immaterium, the 4 powers, their demonic extensions, their capacity for active adversarial agency, wasn't something DAOT humanity appears to have been working against in the way the 41st millennium works against chaos. They knew the warp existed. They navigated it for 10,000 years across millions of light years of galactic colonization. They built warp drives and developed navigator genetics to steer through the immaterium. They built weapons that interacted with warp physics mechanically. The warp was dangerous. It was never safe. but the danger appears to have been treated as a natural hazard with quantifiable parameters, rather than as the domain of conscious and malevolent divine powers coordinating against humanity. This is an inference built from the artifacts, not a canonical statement, but it's an inference the artifacts strongly support. The macro hammer treats warp rift generation as a melee function with calibrated parameters. Phase iron treats warp connection as a physical property that can be disrupted by material chemistry at industrial scale. The Voidclaw's machine spirit appears to operate by rules that entities native to the immaterium haven't encountered before. None of these are designed around appeasing, distracting, or outcompeting chaos gods. They're designed around physical interaction with warp phenomena at an engineering level. The comparison that sharpens this into a transferable framework is the Imperium's own relationship to Xenos.
The Imperium hates Xenos. The xenophobia is total, institutionalized, and in many cases, genocidal. But, and this is the critical distinction, the Imperium doesn't treat Xenos as cosmically terrifying in the way it treats the warp. The Death Watch maintains kill teams with species-specific combat doctrines built on decades of accumulated tactical knowledge. The Ordo Xenos maintains threat classifications, vulnerability analyses, and countermeasures for every significant alien species the Imperium has encountered. There are weapons designed specifically for each category of alien threat, operational procedures for each type of encounter, institutional infrastructure for managing Xenos as a category of problem with solutions. The hatred doesn't preclude systematic management, because managing threats systematically requires treating them as threats, serious, capable, dangerous, rather than as cosmic forces beyond understanding. The 41st millennium's relationship to the warp and its inhabitants is categorically different. The Grey Knights are the closest thing to a systematic counter-demonic force, but even they operate within a framework of spiritual warfare, of the Emperor's divine protection as the ultimate counter to demonic incursion. The warp is treated as a cosmic force to be feared, endured, and survived, not a category of threat to be understood and managed. The fear is real, and the threat is real, but the fear forecloses the kind of systematic engineering engagement that managing a threat requires. Humanity appears to have had a department for dealing with the warp, the same way the Imperium has departments for dealing with Xenos, not the reverence of the Mechanicus, not the fearful bargaining of chaos sorcerers. An institutional, engineering-level approach where warp instability is a parameter to be calibrated, warp connection is a property that can be disrupted by the right alloy, and machine spirits built during this period operate by principles that warp-native entities haven't learned to handle. A dark mechanicum voice, preserved in lexicanum documentation, articulates the opposite side of this gap. The path of the Omnissiah has left humanity dithering in the darkness, incapable of advancing on the paths of knowledge, and embracing the warp reveals technology that the primitives on Mars could never dream of wielding. The Dark Mechanicum's response to the Mechanicus's comprehension failure is to go toward chaos, to gain warp capability by becoming part of the warp. Humanity's response appears to have been something more technically audacious, not merger with the immaterium, but engineering against it, understanding the warp as physics and building accordingly. Both diagnoses agree on the underlying condition. The Adeptus Mechanicus doesn't know what it has. The Mechanicus performs ritual sequences over the Voidclaw, because ritual sequences are the Mechanicus's response to things it can't understand. It maintains macro hammers recovered from the city cache through hymns derived from operational checklists that are themselves derived from engineering documentation now completely gone. It uses phase iron restraints, knowing they work, and knowing it can't make more. The Mechanicus doctrine holds that the machine spirit guards the knowledge of the machine, true in a way the Mechanicus doesn't fully appreciate. The machine spirits and materials of these artifacts are preserving a function
whose underlying physics is invisible to the civilization that now possesses them. The Mechanicus is doing its best with what it has.
The Mechanicus has maintained operational archaeotech through 10,000 years of theological observance, an extraordinary achievement of institutional continuity that the 41st millennium would otherwise not have access to at all.
The problem isn't the Mechanicus's dedication. The problem is that maintaining something doesn't recover the understanding that generated it. The ritual tells you what to do. It doesn't tell you why. The why has been gone since M25. The counterargument is obvious and worth addressing directly. If DAOT humanity could engineer against the warp at this level, how did the Age of Strife destroy them? The answer requires precision. Having engineering tools for managing warp entities is categorically different from having mastered the warp in the sense of controlling it completely. Phase iron is an excellent anti-psyker restraint material. It isn't a defense against Slaanesh being born. The macro hammer creates warp rifts as a combat function. It isn't a weapon capable of closing the Eye of Terror. The Voidclaw appears to involve artificial black hole generation. It isn't a shield against galaxy-spanning warp storms that isolate every human colony from every other. The convergence of catastrophes that ended the Dote, the Men of Iron Rebellion shattering industrial infrastructure, the birth of Slaanesh around M25, triggering a psychic explosion of unprecedented scale across the galaxy, the resulting warp storms that cut off every human world from every other, was a scale of disaster that exceeded any engineering response. The civilization that had phase iron and macro hammers and the Voidclaw fell to it anyway, because when a new chaos god erupts into existence and tears the Eye of Terror into the fabric of space, good material science isn't sufficient to the situation. The engineering tools were real. The catastrophe was simply larger than the tools.
Return to Vigilus. Return to the Citadel Vigilant. Return to the tech priests performing prescribed ritual sequences over a weapon that predates their entire civilization, tending a machine spirit whose design principles are 10,000 years dead, maintaining something they can use but can't understand. The Chaos Sorcerers, who reportedly won't engage with the Voidclaw's machine spirit, are, in that avoidance, providing the most honest data point in this entire argument. An entity who negotiates with gods, who makes their operational practice the finding of leverage over warp native intelligence, stands before a dote machine spirit and determines that the standard approaches don't apply. The standard categories don't fit. The normal frameworks for assessing an immaterium presence don't resolve into anything recognizable. A chaos sorcerer knows what a corrupted machine spirit feels like.
The Dark Mechanicum produces demon engines by the thousand, seeding demon consciousness inside mechanical forms, and chaos practitioners work with these constructs in every major campaign. They know what the simple cogitator-level machine spirits in basic Imperial equipment feel like. They know the stronger, stranger personalities in Titans and Knights, the ones that require elaborate awakening rituals and can exhibit what looks like genuine emotion. They've encountered the full range of machine spirit complexity that the 41st millennium contains. The Voidclaw's machine spirit doesn't sit anywhere on that range. It came from an engineering tradition that produced thinking machines immune to warp influence by fundamental architecture, that built reality manipulation weapons and anti-warp alloys as industrial products, that understood the immaterium as physics rather than theology. Whatever design principles went into a machine spirit from that tradition, whatever the engineers specified, whatever properties they built in, it doesn't offer the handholds the sorcerers use for negotiation, not because it's overwhelmingly powerful, but because it's operating by rules they haven't learned and can't quickly reverse engineer. They avoid it because they can't categorize it, and they can't categorize it because it came from somewhere else, from a paradigm for relating to the warp that ended during the Age of Strife and left no successors.
The macro hammer waits in whatever location the city cache recovery placed it, classified as extremely rare archaeotech, maintained by ritual sequences whose original checklist has been transmuted into him. The phase iron restraints wear out year by year with no replacement process. The Voidclaw sits in the Citadel vigilant, and the tech priests maintain it, and the sorcerers avoid it. And neither camp has quite managed to ask the question that would matter most. What were the engineering principles that produced technology operating by these rules? And what would it look like to recover them? Those principles are gone. The artifacts remain as evidence that they existed. 3 data points on a curve humanity has lost the mathematics for. The debris of a civilization that classified warp entities as threats to manage rather than cosmic forces to fear. A civilization that appears to have maintained something equivalent to what the Imperium now maintains for Xenos. Systematic, institutional, engineering-level threat response to entities from the Immaterium. Documented procedures for handling warp phenomena. Material science adequate to the problem. The Age of Strife took the civilization. The Dark Age of Technology took the paradigm. The 41st millennium inherited the fragments. The Voidclaw exists. The macro hammer exists. Phase iron exists. Held by a civilization that maintains them through ritual observance and treats them as evidence of divine will. Surrounded by entities who interact with the warp through fear and bargaining and reverence. In a galaxy where the closest thing anyone has to the DAOT's engineering relationship with warp physics is the Dark Mechanicum's decision to embrace chaos entirely. Whatever humanity built during those 10,000 years before the Age of Strife, it scared the things that scare everyone else. And the civilization that built it's gone. And the knowledge that generated it's gone. And what remains is a weapon in a fortress, a checklist in a hymn, an alloy wearing out in a containment cell, evidence of an approach to the warp that the entire 41st millennium has forgotten how to have. Subscribe if you want more patterns like this pulled from the footnotes of the 41st millennium.